Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to take you into the hidden world of avoidance psychology, into the quiet space they disappear into the silence they hide behind, into the walls they believe will protect them, and into the exact moment that silence finally breaks. When an avoidant first enters silence after a breakup or emotional withdrawal, the very first feeling that washes over them is relief. This relief isn't because they didn't care, or because the relationship meant nothing, or because you were difficult. It happens because avoidants have been conditioned, often since childhood, to associate closeness with overwhelm. When emotions get intense, when someone needs clarity, when connection gets deep, their nervous system interprets it as danger. Their instinct is not to communicate, their instinct is to retreat. So the very beginning of silence feels like the pressure valve being released. The noise stops, the expectations fade, the emotional atmosphere calms. They feel free, but not in the joyful way people imagine free, in the sense that their stress drops, their shoulders relax, their panic quiets. To them, relief is simply the absence of emotional overload. But this early relief is not the whole story, because avoidants experience emotions in delayed waves. They do not process in real time. They don't feel the impact of your absence immediately. They don't feel the loss while you're still trying. They don't feel the weight while you're still reaching out. Their emotional system is wired in reverse. They feel times after times the moment has passed, not during it. And this is why clarity comes later. In the beginning, silence is simply medicine for their overwhelmed mind. They use it to stabilize, not to forget. They use it to breathe, not to erase. Their calm isn't rejection, it's self-regulation. What most people don't understand is that once the initial wave of relief settles, a psychological shift begins. The nervous system calms, the panic dissolves, their emotional bandwidth returns, and this is when the clarity begins to form. In the absence of pressure, their mind becomes free to think not defensively, not reactively, but reflectively. Avoidants cannot reflect under pressure. They reflect only in calm. That's why arguments, explanations, or emotional pleas never move them closer. Their brain is too overwhelmed to process. But silence removes the emotional noise. And when silence becomes quiet enough, reflection starts. This reflection is the foundation of the clarity that comes later. They begin thinking about you not as a source of emotional activation, but as a person. The fear that blurred everything before starts to fade, allowing the truth to take shape. They remember moments that felt good. They remember your calmness, your presence, your softness. They remember the connection, but without the intensity that once frightened them. This clarity is the first moment where their emotional avoidance begins to weaken. Clarity for an avoidant is not dramatic or sudden. It's subtle, creeping, and internal. It starts with curiosity. I wonder how they're doing. Then it becomes awareness. They're not reaching out anymore. Then concern. Did they move on? Then realization. I haven't really processed the relationship at all. And then the truth hits, the emotional truth they never allowed themselves to feel while you were close. Avoidants don't feel the depth of the connection until the emotional pressure is gone. They don't feel what you meant until you're no longer trying. They don't see what they had until they have space to see it from a distance. Relief cracks open the doorway, but clarity walks through it. This clarity also exposes something they didn't expect, that your absence feels different than they imagined. They expected peace. They expected emotional quiet. But instead, they start feeling a subtle emotional ache, a pull, a void. Not because they need you, but because the fear that suppressed their feelings is no longer controlling their thoughts. Clarity also brings a kind of emotional honesty avoidants rarely face. Without pressure, they can finally admit things to themselves, that they were more attached than they showed, that your presence meant more than they expressed, that they weren't as unaffected as they acted. This self-honesty is frightening for them because it contradicts the story they told themselves to justify detachment. The clarity stage is the beginning of emotional shift, the point where the absence of stress allows the presence of truth. It is the first moment where longing becomes possible, the first moment where regret can surface, the first moment where memory becomes louder than fear. And this is exactly why their silence doesn't stay silence forever, because avoidance only works when fear is louder than connection. But once the fear settles, the connection begins to speak. And that is when the silence starts cracking, not because you chased, but because they finally have the emotional space to feel what they couldn't feel before. Avoidants don't break in silence because they suddenly miss someone. They break because silence forces them to confront something they have spent their entire lives avoiding. Asterisk, asterisk, their own emotional truth. Asterisk, asterisk, when you stop contacting them, when your voice disappears, when the messages stop, when the familiar rhythm of your presence is gone, you create a psychological environment. Avoidants never choose deliberately an environment with no distractions, no emotional noise, no external pressure. And what fills that space is something they are deeply uncomfortable with, themselves. Avoidants depend on emotional avoidance as their primary survival mechanism. They stay busy. They detach. They distract. They rationalize. They intellectualize everything so they don't have to feel anything. But your silence takes away one of their biggest emotional shields, your energy. Whether they reacted to it with panic or withdrawal, your energy kept their mind focused outward. Once that energy is gone, they have no one to push against, no dynamic to defend themselves from, no emotional structure to resist. Silence becomes an empty room where the only thing left is their own reflection. At first, they don't see much. The relief of distance still lingers. But as silence continues, the mirror becomes clearer. There is no message to ignore, no call to avoid, no emotional tone to manage, no expectations to dodge. The absence of these things is what forces their attention inward. For avoidance, inward focus is unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and often painful. Their childhood likely taught them to suppress, not express. They learned that emotions meant vulnerability, vulnerability meant danger, and danger meant loss. So they built their identity around escape, escape from pressure, escape from depth, escape from intimacy. But your silence removes the external escape route. Without anything coming from you, they are left alone with the internal world they've been suppressing. That quiet, that isolation, that lack of contact becomes the psychological mirror they never wanted to face. And this is where the shift begins. They start noticing things they didn't notice before your absence, your calmness, your detachment. They begin questioning not you, but themselves. Questions like, why do I feel this void? Why does this silence feel heavier than I expected? Why am I thinking about them more now than when they were reaching out? Why does this feel different from other times I withdrew? These questions arise because silence removes the emotional noise that kept them distracted. It exposes the emotional patterns they've been running from. When you were reaching out, they could blame the pressure. When you were trying, they could blame the intensity. When you were communicating, they could blame overwhelm. But when you're silent, they can't assign their emotional discomfort to you anymore. The only place left to look is inward. And avoidants are not used to that. The mirror of silence also reflects their own contradictions back to them. They see the push-pull dynamic clearly for the first time, how they wanted closeness but feared it, how they craved connection but couldn't sustain it, how they felt something deeper but shut it down before it took root. Without your presence to manage, they begin recognizing their own patterns. And this recognition creates an emotional ripple, the beginning of awareness, the beginning of truth, the beginning of something shifting. Avoidants don't realize what they feel until the stimulus is gone. The absence becomes sharper than the presence ever was. Silence quiets their fear long enough for the memory of connection to surface. And the mirror of silence shows them something powerful. The relationship wasn't the problem their fear was. Your silence doesn't attack their fear, it exposes it. It shows them how much of their emotional behavior was self-protection, not logic. It shows them how quickly they disconnect when things get real. It shows them that they didn't walk away because they didn't feel they walked away, because they did feel. And most importantly, silence reveals the impact you actually had on them. When they no longer have anything to resist, they are finally able to remember. And memory is emotional. Memory is attachment. Memory is connection resurfacing without the cloud of overwhelm. This is why silence is the most powerful mirror for an avoidant. It makes them see the connection clearly for the first time, without fear standing in the way. And once they see the truth, once they feel something beyond relief, once memory becomes louder than avoidance, the silence they created begins working against them. That's the moment the mirror becomes too uncomfortable to ignore. That's the moment clarity becomes stronger than distance, and that's the moment their silence first begins to crack. When an avoidant enters silence, their emotional system goes through a predictable shift, even though on the outside nothing seems to be happening. In the beginning, distance feels like relief. But relief is shallow, temporary, and surface level. Once their nervous system settles and the emotional pressure is gone, they enter a stage most people never see. Asterisk, asterisk, emotional neutrality. Asterisk, asterisk. This stage is powerful because it is the first time the avoidance fear stops speaking and the first time their memory begins to speak louder. It is the moment the emotional fog lifts and the truth they couldn't access earlier starts to rise to the surface. Avoidants do not process emotions in the moment. When you were reaching out, when you were explaining your feelings, when you were asking for clarity, they weren't ignoring you because they didn't care. They were ignoring you because they were overwhelmed. Their brain cannot handle emotional intensity in real time. Their instinct is to pull away, shut down, and escape the pressure. In that moment, your emotional closeness feels like too much, even if your intentions were loving. Their withdrawal is emotional self-protection, not emotional indifference. But after the dust settles, when no messages are coming in, when they aren't being asked to emotionally respond, when no one is trying to pull closeness out of them, that is when emotional neutrality begins. And emotional neutrality is not numbness, it's not detachment, it's not moving on. It's the clearing of emotional overload, it's the quiet after the storm. It's the space where their mind finally has enough capacity to reflect instead of defend. In this stage, their nervous system finally feels safe, and when they feel safe, they don't run anymore. They begin to remember. This is the moment when the avoidant starts recalling you, not as the source of emotional pressure, but as a person. They begin to remember the good moments, your care, your softness, your patience. They remember your energy, the way you made them feel grounded, the way you made them feel chosen. They remember the small moments that didn't register earlier because their fear was too loud. They remember things that didn't feel important at the time, but feel significant now that everything is quiet. This is why emotional neutrality is the stage where memory replaces fear. Their avoidance isn't activated, so their nervous system isn't blocking emotional reflection. For the first time, they can look at the relationship without feeling trapped. They can think about you without panicking. They can remember without shutting down. This shift is subtle, but extremely powerful. It's the part where they begin to feel instead of react. In emotional neutrality, their thoughts become anchored. Instead of "I need space," they think, "I wonder how they're doing." Instead of "I feel overwhelmed," they think, "I miss the way the connection felt when it was calm." Instead of "I can't handle this," they think, "Maybe I didn't handle that the right way." Emotional neutrality creates a space where regret can plant its seed, where longing can begin to grow, where curiosity begins to rise. This is also the stage where the avoidant begins comparing the before and after. Before no contact, they felt pressure. After no contact, they feel a strange quiet, a quiet that is both peaceful and unsettling. They expected the silence to give them clarity instantly, but instead, clarity comes slowly, through memory. They begin realizing they didn't actually want to lose the connection, they wanted to escape the emotional intensity. They begin to see the difference between your love and their fear, and that the difference becomes clearer the longer you stay silent. In emotional neutrality, the avoidant also loses the emotional narrative they use to justify their withdrawal. They can no longer say they're being too emotional because there is no emotion coming toward them. They can no longer say they're overwhelming me because no one is asking anything from them. They can no longer say I need space because they already have space. And in that spaciousness, they begin to question themselves instead of you. This is the shift they fear the most: self-reflection. Avoidants do not like emotional accountability. They don't like realizing they contributed to the breakdown. But emotional neutrality forces them into reflection, gently, quietly, privately. They begin to see where they shut down too quickly, where they misunderstood your intentions, where they projected fear onto you, where they withdrew instead of communicating. These realizations don't come with panic. They come with calm clarity, the kind they never experience when emotions are high. Emotional neutrality is also where the avoidant starts feeling the first subtle hints of loss, not because they need you, but because the fear that blocked connection is no longer in the way. Loss can only be felt when fear is quiet, and this is the first moment the avoidant can truly sense your absence. This stage is essential because it is the psychological gateway to the next one, the emotional trigger that finally cracks their silence. But emotional neutrality is the stage where the groundwork is laid. It is where memory becomes stronger than overwhelm. It is where longing becomes possible. It is where your absence begins to take shape in their emotional world, not as relief, but as realization. And it is this realization born in the quietest part of no contact that eventually makes their silence impossible to maintain. The moment an avoidant silence breaks is not random, accidental, or mysterious. It happens at a very specific emotional point, the moment when something in their environment triggers a memory of you so strongly that it overwhelms their avoidance response. Up to this point, their silence was a way to regulate themselves, to escape emotional pressure, to reset their nervous system. But avoidance cannot outrun emotional association forever. Eventually, a trigger appears that is stronger than the fear that made them withdraw. This trigger becomes the emotional crack in the wall they built. Avoidants store memories differently than others. When they're overwhelmed, they block emotional input. When they're calm, old emotions begin resurfacing. That's why no contact works, because you remove emotional pressure. And in that quiet, memories rise more naturally. But the silence alone doesn't break them, it prepares them. What truly shatters their silence is an emotional contrast moment, when something reminds them of the connection in a way they can no longer ignore. This trigger can be unpredictable and completely ordinary. It might be a photo they forgot to delete, a song that once played during a moment with you, a location tied to a memory, a smell that takes them back, a line from a movie, a quiet evening when the loneliness feels heavier than usual. It could be a sudden failure at work that makes them crave emotional safety. It could be seeing someone else receive the kind of love you gave them. It could be noticing someone new isn't you, not your softness, not your patience, not your presence. And in that moment, their silence stops feeling safe and starts feeling suffocating. Triggers for avoidance work like emotional flashbacks. They pull the avoidant out of the logical, detached state they prefer and drag them into the emotional reality they've been avoiding. Suddenly, they're not thinking about the relationship with defensiveness. They're remembering it with clarity. They're not running from your emotions. They're feeling their own. They're not focusing on pressure. They're feeling the loss. This emotional contrast is what awakens the part of them they try to keep dormant, the part that cared more deeply than they admitted. This moment is so powerful because it disrupts the emotional story they told themselves to justify leaving or withdrawing. While they were overwhelmed, they convinced themselves that distance was the best choice. They told themselves you were too much, that the relationship was too demanding, that they needed space. But the trigger pulls them into a different story, a more honest one. A story where you were emotionally safe, where your presence stabilized them, where your connection mattered more than their fear. When this realization hits, the emotional story they constructed collapses. This emotional contrast moment also reveals the emptiness that silence cannot fill. Avoidants assume distance will create peace, but the trigger exposes the truth. The peace they felt was relief from pressure, not relief from connection. The trigger makes them aware of the void your absence created. They begin to feel the difference between solitude and loneliness. Solitude was something they chose. Loneliness is something they didn't expect. And loneliness has a way of waking up feelings they buried. What makes this trigger so powerful is that it bypasses their defenses. Avoidance can rationalize anything when they feel in control. But a trigger is emotional, not rational. It ambushes them. It confronts them with the truth that they still feel something. It makes them realize the connection didn't fade, it was only muted. And this new awareness becomes stronger than the silence they've been hiding behind. In this moment, avoidance stops working. It stops protecting them. It becomes the very thing that hurts them. Silence, once their emotional refuge, becomes the source of discomfort. They start feeling restless. They start feeling uneasy. They start overthinking. They start wondering about you, what you're doing, who you're with, whether you've moved on. They begin imagining scenarios that scare them. You laughing with someone else, you healing without them, you forgetting the connection altogether. The trigger makes them realize something they never expected. They're no longer avoiding you, they're avoiding the truth they feel about you. This is the exact emotional moment their silence cracks. The fear of closeness no longer outweighs the fear of loss. The emotional safety of distance no longer outweighs the emotional discomfort of missing you. In this moment, the past becomes stronger than the fear. The memory becomes louder than the silence. And the avoidant finally feels the pull toward the connection, a pull they couldn't feel before because their emotional world wasn't calm enough to let it in. This is why silence breaks. Not because you chased, not because you demanded, not because you begged, not because you tried harder. Silence breaks because the avoidant finally feels something deeper than fear, a reminder of what they lost and a longing that their avoidance can no longer smother. Avoidants do not break their silence because someone keeps reaching out. They don't melt under pressure, they don't respond to emotional intensity, and they don't come closer when someone tries harder. Their protective system is wired to shut down when contact continues. But when you stop, when you pull back all your energy, when you become quiet, grounded, and emotionally self-contained, that's when something begins to shift inside them. The silence you create doesn't just affect them, it reshapes the entire emotional dynamic. Your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was. And this is the truth most people don't understand. Avoidants come forward only when they feel the space is safe, not when they feel cornered. When you were reaching out, their fear was activated. Avoidants interpret emotional closeness as danger because they equate it with pressure to respond, pressure to meet expectations, pressure to be emotionally available in ways they don't feel capable of. Even your gentle attempts to understand them could feel overwhelming. They weren't processing your love, they were reacting to the emotional weight behind it. But when you stop reaching out, that weight disappears. The environment becomes emotionally neutral again. This neutrality is essential because avoidants cannot feel connection until their fear is calm. Your silence removes the threat. It tells their nervous system, you are not required to give anything right now. That message, even without words, is powerful for them. It's the emotional safety they needed but never articulated. In that safety, their avoidance response begins to settle. Their mind is no longer focused on defending itself, so it becomes free to think about the connection from a softer place. This is why silence works not as manipulation, but as emotional regulation. You aren't punishing them. You're simply creating the only emotional environment where their heart has room to breathe. As you withdraw your energy, their mental narrative begins to shift. Instead of thinking, I need space, they start wondering, why is it so quiet now? Instead of feeling overwhelmed, they begin to feel curious. Instead of interpreting you as a source of pressure, they begin to see you as a source of calm. Your silence replaces emotional intensity with emotional clarity, and clarity is the first step to reflection. Avoidants cannot reflect when they feel pursued. They reflect when they feel free. No contact creates contrast. When you were reaching out, they couldn't see you clearly because fear distorted everything. They saw closeness as threat. But when you step back, they see you through the lens of memory and calm, not panic. They remember your kindness, your stability, your presence. They remember how you loved them in a way that didn't demand perfection. They remember the comfort of the connection without associating it with overwhelm. It's only in your absence that they can evaluate the relationship with emotional accuracy. The most surprising thing for avoidants is how your silence affects them internally. At first, they think the quiet is exactly what they wanted, but as time passes, silence becomes unfamiliar. It feels empty, not peaceful. It feels cold, not comforting. It feels like something important went missing. And what went missing wasn't pressure, it was times you asterisk. This is the moment when their fear of closeness shifts into fear of loss. They begin to feel the weight of what they've created. They begin to sense the consequences of their withdrawal. And when that fear of losing someone safe grows stronger than the fear of intimacy, their silence breaks. Your silence also shows them a version of you they didn't expect, a version that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't demand, and doesn't collapse. Avoidants are used to people pushing for clarity, pushing for connection, pushing for answers. When you don't, they don't feel relief. They feel intrigue. They feel respect. They feel the emotional weight of your self-control, your dignity, your strength. They begin to see you as someone who values their own peace, and that changes how they perceive the entire relationship. When you stop chasing, you shift from being the emotionally overwhelming force in their life to being the emotionally grounded one. And groundedness is irresistible to avoidance. They don't trust intensity, They trust stability. They trust calm. They trust distance that isn't filled with bitterness. They trust people who can stand alone emotionally. Your silence is not just quiet, it is emotional confidence. It's the one thing that doesn't activate their avoidance. Eventually, your silence becomes a question inside their mind, a question they can't escape. Why aren't they reaching out? Did they stop caring? Did they move on? Did I matter? Was the connection more important than I thought? These questions grow louder as the silence continues. And at some point, the emotional discomfort of times not knowing times becomes stronger than the discomfort of closeness. That's the moment they reach out, not because they're ready to reconnect, but because their avoidance no longer protects them from the truth they feel. Avoidants don't come back because you chase. They come back because you don't. Because your silence makes them face the emotional reality they tried to avoid. Because they finally feel something their fear once blocked. Because distance no longer soothes them, it awakens them. And that awakening begins the moment your absence becomes more powerful than your presence. The breaking point for an avoidant doesn't happen when you cry, when you explain, when you beg, or when you ask for closure. It happens in a much quieter, a deeper moment. The moment when the fear of times losing you, times finally becomes stronger than the fear of times being close to you. Asterisk. Avoidants spend their entire lives governed by one emotional law. Asterisk, closeness is dangerous. Asterisk. This belief shapes everything they do. It makes them shut down, pull away, and disconnect the moment someone gets too close. But what they never prepare for is the emotional backlash that comes when the connection is gone. Not because they pushed you away, but because times you didn't come back. Asterisk. No contact isn't about punishing them. It isn't about teaching them a lesson. It isn't about winning. It's about allowing the avoidance emotional system to reveal its truth. And the truth always reveals itself in the same sequence. First, they feel relief. Then, they feel calm. Then, they feel neutrality. But eventually, something inside them shifts. The silence they once craved becomes the silence they cannot escape. At that point, their fear of intimacy finally quiets down, and the fear they've been running from their entire life rises to the surface. Asterisk, the fear of losing someone who was safe. Asterisk, avoidants have deep attachment wounds. They fear depending on someone. They fear being needed. They fear emotional expectations. But what they fear even more, though they'll never say it, is loving someone who walks away. Their entire strategy is built around emotional control. The moment they feel something too deeply, they retreat to protect themselves. Walking away gives them the illusion of control. But when you stop chasing, you take that control away. Suddenly, they're not the one deciding the emotional tone of the connection. Suddenly, they're not the one choosing distance. Suddenly, their silence becomes a question instead of protection. This is when the shift begins. Their silence no longer comforts them. It starts poking at their fears. It makes them wonder whether they misread the connection, whether they pushed away someone irreplaceable, whether they confused pressure with love. When the fear of loss grows, it exposes every assumption they use to justify avoidance. They start questioning whether the relationship was actually overwhelming, or whether times their fear times was. They start remembering moments where they felt safe with you but didn't admit it. They start reflecting on how consistent, patient, and steady you were. They start seeing you, not through the lens of their panic, but through the lens of memory. The weight of loss hits an avoidant, slowly but powerfully. It shows up in the little things. First, an empty evening, a memory that catches them off guard, a moment where they need comfort but don't allow themselves to reach for anyone. Then it grows. They begin realizing that the connection they once treated casually wasn't casual at all. They begin realizing you weren't asking for emotional intensity, you were offering emotional partnership. They begin realizing that the pressure they felt wasn't coming from you, but from their own wounds. And now that you're gone, their fear of intimacy loses its foundation. There is no one to run from. The threat they imagined is gone. Their defenses don't know what to fight anymore. Once the avoidant can't use fear of closeness as a shield, they have to face the truth beneath it. They cared. They cared more than they showed, more than they admitted, more than they allowed themselves to feel. And the realization that they cared too late becomes the emotional breaking point. Because caring means loss hurts. Caring means silence is no longer a choice, it's a consequence. Caring means the emotional distance they built to protect themselves is now the very thing causing them pain. This is the moment the avoidant silence cracks. The loss becomes sharper than the fear. The emptiness becomes louder than their walls. The longing becomes stronger than their self-protection. Their mind no longer says, "Distance keeps me safe." It begins saying, "Distance is costing me something I didn't want to lose." That shift, subtle, internal, unspoken, flips the emotional equation. Avoidants always choose the path with less fear. When closeness feels scary, they choose distance. But when losing you feels scarier, they choose closeness. Not perfect closeness, not emotional fluency, but movement. A message, a check-in, a sign of life, an opening. The moment their fear of losing you surpasses their fear of needing you, the silence they've been hiding behind finally breaks. And in that moment, the avoidant stops running from the connection and starts running from the possibility that it may already be gone.